we'll kind of get rolling. The reason for our conversation today is we've seen from the surveys last fall that there's increasing populations of wheat stem sawfly in various parts of southern Alberta. And in particular, it seems the county of 40 Mile had a spike in the populations, and they're seeing possibly declines in populations in Willow Creek and Vulcan County. And yeah, I just wanted to get your guys's feedback on the numbers and what it looks like. Why do you think we're seeing such an increase in this sawfly damage?
Okay, so as an entomologist, I can say that insect populations fluctuate all the time, especially pest populations. Sawfly in particular will go up and down depending on the weather of the past few years. We know from experience that sawfly populations build up in drier years or a series of drier years. When wheat matures earlier, like it would in a drier year, the biocontrol insect that controls sawfly doesn't have a chance to complete its life cycle properly, its second generation life cycle. So that means that it's not as good at killing sawfly in drier years.
Okay, awesome. Do you think that any of the winter conditions are playing into perhaps a stronger population concern this year?
I would say no. I think the thing you have to remember about insect pests like sawfly and grasshopper, they like to thrive in dry weather, and so we had in 2018 and 2019. Very dry weather. So I know off the top of my head, I know we're talking about wheat, but I've got the clear context of canola that, we went from really good yields, a very good period in southern Alberta to where we were at I don't even know if we got 15 bushels an acre in 2018 for canola. And then we were down to 5 in 2019. So it was a total bust, and wheat wasn't a lot better. And that's when we started to hear about sawfly, thriving again. And I think we would have heard about it even more this past year. But we got back to a little bit timely rains and a little bit better weather that way. And my guess is, that it's such a resilient insect. Like you can have like 10% cutting damage, and if the conditions are right, it'll be anywhere from 40 to 70% cutting the following year. So exponential isn't even a good word to describe the rate of reproductive capacity of this insect. But I think we better heed that sawfly forecast though, and prepare.
Haley, did you have anything to add?
Yeah, so there have been a few studies on winter survival, overwintering survival, and I know there's work ongoing out of Saskatchewan on this too. One of them's from 2011 from Hector Carcamo and Brian and colleagues, and they measured about 8% mortality or death over the winter. So the winters don't kill the sawflies that much. In lab studies, they showed the insect to be very, very cold hardy. Plus they overwinter near the ground, right at the base of the stubs, so they're pretty protected. But I do have to say that a model done by a researcher in Montana showed that if we could change overwintering survival, it would be very influential on the population dynamics. So if something does change, it'll change the populations quite a bit.
Well, as we talk right now, look outside. It was raining in January, and that's new to me, and I've grown up in southern Alberta, so we seem to be going in the other direction.
Yeah, but sometimes warmer temperatures are bad for insects too, right? Because it keeps their metabolism running at a higher rate than it would be if it was colder. So they can burn through their energy more in a warmer winter sometimes. So it could go either way, really. We don't know.
Fair enough.
Mm-hmm.
And what types of crops should we be, focusing on? What host plants? Are there weeds that are going to play into the populations this year? How does that look?
Okay, so the host crops are cereal crops, right? So wheat is the main host, spring wheat, durum, barley is another big host. Winter wheat escapes sawfly just based on its timing, and oats are not a host. But in terms of weeds, yeah, some native grasses or wild grasses can be hosts for sawfly too. That's one of my concerns as grasses from the south move north, as you know, as our climate changes. There could be more alternative hosts for sawfly populations acting as a reservoir to invade crops earlier.
Awesome.
Yeah, I think we're doing the best we can with the crop question, because this was a much bigger problem when we were strictly a wheat fallow system. And thanks to no-till and direct seeding, we've moved into two things that affect it, because we know continuous cropping and direct seeding, that can have an impact, because you are breaking up the stubble somewhat where they are overwinterings, and that does actually reduce the population regardless of the plant going in. It's more of a pre-seed tactic. But we're way more diverse now with our crops. And so we're not, wheat is 1 and 3, 1 and 4 now. And we're certainly not going to advocate, forget about the wheat phase. Because although canola is king, wheat's still very important.
So is it perhaps a recommendation for growers to consider switching up their rotations, though, if they had plans for growing winter like wheat this spring, or are changing into a different crop entirely, or what's the recommendation maybe?
Well, here's my perspective on that. It's more of a variety selection. So probably right now we're in January. A farmer's thinking about the wheat phase with respect to market class, right? So let's say they are thinking CWRS, so bread wheat. So they want to grow bread wheat, and they had their heart set on a particular variety, but that variety is hollow stem. And if you don't know, you need to find out and ask your dealer or contact one of us to point you in the right direction. But the thing to switch there is just switch into a solid stem. And although the irony is, 20 years ago when we had this big problem, there were a lot of CWS varieties, not a lot, but there were some good solid stem choices, nothing in Durham at the time. And I really harped on that. And today we've got some super good Durhams that are solid stem. Varieties like Stronghold, Fortitude. That's what I would be looking at if I was a Durham grower. If I was a CWS grower, I'd be switching into something like CDC Adamant that's solid. Hughes and Landmark are okay too, but they are actually semi-solid.
Hi, Hector. Welcome. Hope you don't mind we started without you.
Hey, Brian, that adamant there, is that CWRS?
Yeah.
Oh, I didn't know about that.
Brian, do you think there's going to be any impact from the 5 varieties that are switching classes coming August 1st? Or do you have any comment on those?
You mean the ones that are being moved down to CNHR?
Yeah.
Yeah, so that was a real concern, and it's why we only have one true solid stem variety available right now. Like all the other ones, and they are older now, but all the other ones like Lillian, Tonya, and so on, based on new specifications for gluten, primarily gluten strength, they and a bunch of other CWS varieties were kicked down into sort of this catch-all class of CNHR. And so it's not an ideal class, I think, for growers to, as plan A. I think it's much more strategic to try and get your hands on some CDC Adamant or plan, I would then maybe Hughes and Landmark if seed supply is an issue. And then at that point, think about, maybe something else if those aren't available. But the point to stress though is that's step 1, and there's even pre-seed residue management as step 1A. Step 1B would be your variety, and then there's tactics all along that you need to be monitoring, and the entomologists in the group here can tell you about the need to be diligent around surveillance to assess your threat through through the growing season. And then if you do know you've got a problem or a potential problem, then you can start thinking about, okay, I'm going to have to swath this before it goes down from a windstorm, because the cutting levels are going to be very high. So that's where you would make the decision to swath versus straight cut. And we actually have a model for that to predict that we should maybe try and get housed on your website or something, Jamie.
Yeah, certainly. Is that one of these documents that you sent to me?
Well, it's in there. No, we can try and get you the executable file. The other thing I was going to say is, you know, what we don't know about the brand new solid stem varieties in CWRS is how they respond to seeding rate. And everyone would probably know by now that we really stress a high seeding rate. But the only exception to that was something like a Lillian. So if there was a Lillian type variety or a solid stem in general, we would tell you to back off to about 300 seeds per square meter or 30 seeds per square foot, because if those genes interact too much with environment, shading becomes the real trigger that inhibits stem solidness. And so we kind of need that canopy opened up a little bit in order for that gene to express. So backing off on seeding rates is in CWS might still be a requirement. And you got to kind of temper your nitrogen as well, because we know, you know, a super lush canopy as a result of nitrogen is going to be an issue too. Now, the one thing though that we know from a study we ran is the Durhams, however, they're not affected by that. So you can go the high seeding you wanted to with Durham, and you won't be impacting or inhibiting stem solidness at all.
Brian, is there any difference between the solid stem and then the semi-solid stem? Is there sort of a compromise there, since there doesn't seem to be a lot of varieties in the solid stem that are sort of out there right now?
Yeah, so we had one before as well called Mackenzie, which was a fantastic variety, and honestly, Lillian ended up being more semi-solid as well. But Hughes and Landmark semi-solid right now, Adamant the only solid in CWS. And so, you know, it's a give and a take. You're kind of rolling the dice that the semi-solid's going to express to its full potential, but it might not. So, you know, we saw years where Lillian and Mackenzie are environments where they would express really, really nicely, and other environments where, you know, we saw Lillian cut up to 90%. So there's risk involved in semi-solid, and guys would go that way. Guys and girls would go that way because of the yield advantage. In fact, some just completely rolled the dice and said, you know what, at the time, Superb was a super high yielding variety compared to, say, some of the others. And the guys were just saying, you know what, I'm just taking that chance. Now, especially in the Durham class and even something like Adamant, they're really close to the Czech varieties that are hollow stemmed. And so I don't see the need to risk that like before.
Interesting. Thank you. Hey, Hector, question for you. What do you think the potential loss or impact on the crops is when we have these high wheat stem sawfly numbers? What can farmers expect to see?
Well, we should ask Brian again. He actually did a study, a very detailed study. I was also involved, but Brian was the PI, where they got people to actually pick up by hand what was left on the ground after you harvest with actual the reels to pick up the stems. And the thing to remember is that there are two kinds of yield losses that happen from the Wheat Stem Sawfly, right? The first one, it already happened by the larva mining inside the stem up and down. So that accounts for about 13% of yield losses. And then the rest comes from the material that is left on the ground. And that's about another 12%. And it seems to be quite consistent across sawfly species, because there was also a study in Turkey where they assessed the yield losses, and it was interestingly very, very close, even though they have a different species there. So you lose about 25% of yield when you have these very high levels of sawfly infestation. it can be a big dent into your pocket.
Definitely. Brian or Haley, did you have anything to add?
Just that it could be up as high as 30%, like anywhere from 10 to 15%, equally attributed to both of those, the feeding and then the, you know, the inability. And then there's the intangibles, like maybe you didn't plan on swathing. Well, now you're swathing. You're going to have to buy pickup fingers that maybe you didn't plan on. And we all know what parts are like now for cost. So an operational cost to add another, you know, operation in the harvest management scheme is expensive.
Definitely. Haley, anything else?
Well, I've seen photos of almost complete losses, you know, in really, really infested fields. And somebody on one of the agronomists on Twitter was saying 70% cutting in some of her fields. I mean, that's anecdotal evidence, right? But in some cases, just like with any insect, it can be quite severe.
Right. And so what are some of the, you know, best management practices that can be employed to help combat potentially high populations this year of wheat stem sawfly? Brian, why don't you take it off and then we'll...
Okay, sorry. So we've talked about variety selection. We probably should, you know, have an idea based on, you know, you can even do it now. Like if you go to your stubble now and dig up some stubs and split them open, you know, you can quickly factor on every count of 10 stems what you have for present overwintering larvae to get ready. So variety selection would prompt you to do that. You know, a good heavy harrowing operation ahead of seeding, that's going to help a little bit. Not huge, but it's still an incremental reduction. There's no real seed treatment or foliar insecticide that works, but we do have some data that shows, you know, they generally all these years that we studied emergence, they tend to cluster around growing degree days if you plot that out. But I don't know if we fine-tuned that quite enough to say, yeah, go out and plant at a certain growing degree day, but you know, that's something we can discuss in the spring, I guess. Again, watch the seeding rates, moderate your seeding rates if you've got something in the CWRS, and then for the fall, just be ready to swath. So, you know, again, go back and check your stems and see if what you've got in there for stem boring activity. If you split the stem, you know, if you're getting 4, and I think we showed that decision support system, you know, and anywhere in the neighborhood of 4 to 6 out of 10 stems that appear to have a larva, it probably means you should swath, particularly if it's dry, because we know the only thing that's going to probably kill that insect at that point is the beneficial insect. And if it's a dry year, they're not going to get that second cycle that's really the critical cycle in the fall to kill the larva or the sawfly. So they're probably going to thrive. And that means your crop's going to go down if you're waiting to straight cut it. I've heard story after story of, you know, everything was standing great, you know, close to the you know, the long weekend. And on the Friday we went camping, came back on Sunday, and the whole thing was down.
Oof.
That's how quickly it happened. And I remember there were years like when Hector and I kind of got started on this at the same time, Hector doing entomology, me doing the agronomics. So we went out with Bob Byers out to Skiff to look at a field. And it was honestly like entering another world. Like it was just out of this world. It was dry. There were grasshoppers there, and the whole thing was down. Like it was just, it's quite a sight to behold, I'll tell you. Not too many farmers I think would want to like replicate that if they could help it. There's a lot of planning that needs to go into limiting the damage once you've assessed your threat.
Awesome. Hector, did you have anything to add?
I'm sure you already talked about crop rotations, right? that probably the number one thing you can do to reduce the amount of sawfly is to diversify your cropping system. There's a very good example, I think, if you look at the situation in Montana and Alberta. In Montana, they have a perennial problem with sawfly. Like, it's probably the number one threat to crop production there, it's the sawfly. And I think it's because they don't have a very diversified system. They plant a lot of wheat, a lot of cereals, whereas in Alberta, we tend to plant more pulses, more oilseed crops, sugar beets, other things. So if you're finding a lot of issues with sawfly, I think the best thing you can do is reduce the frequency of planting cereal crops. That might be, I think, a really good tip. There is an interesting anecdote that I've heard that people have used to clean up a field with lots of sawfly, which I think is very interesting to validate with research, but maybe somebody would like to try it out there. And this is Scott Mears' brother. He had a field that had, the whole field went down in sawfly one year. So the following year, his brother planted mustard in the field. This is by Oyen in the eastern area, where there's always a perennial issue with sawfly, or very often. So he planted mustard in the field, but the perimeter he planted oats. And that's kind of in ecology, they have a thing called the push-pull trap crop system, where you plant a crop in the middle that will repel the insect. So the sawfly is going to fly away from the middle, away from the mustard, to find the host in the perimeter. So it will go into the oats. And oats, it's immune to sawfly. Not only it's immune, but it's actually toxic to sawflies. So it will kill the sawfly. But if you want to make sure, you can harvest and chop the oats and feed it as forage. And that's probably a really good way to get rid of sawfly in the field.
Neat.
One other thing we have to mention too, we haven't really talked too much about the beneficial insect or the biocontrol insect for sawfly.
Not yet. You have not yet talked about it.
I was saving it for you, Hector. So yeah, we're talking about a little tiny biocontrol parasitoid wasp that will find stems with sawfly larvae in them and inject its egg inside that stem. And the biocontrol larva will eat the sawfly out. Like, so there's a battle going on right inside your wheat stem. And there's different management things you can do to help that biocontrol insect. Maybe that's where I'll pass it to you, Hector.
But maybe one thing to remember about the biocontrol, this little parasitoid, is you can actually help it to overwinter better if you use a stripper header to harvest the crop. So the taller the stubble that you leave, the better for the parasitoid to overwinter. So that's a really good bit of information to keep in mind. And another thing that we have done with Brian in the past is also we tried mixing cultivars, especially if you don't have I guess you're concerned about protein and about losing yield, which is not necessarily the case, but we have shown that you could actually improve the population of the parasitoid by mixing the hollow stem and the solid stem cultivars. That way you provide a better host for the sawfly, but you also provide a good host for the parasitoid, so you can kind of stabilize the populations of the sawfly and the parasitoid over the long term.
And yeah, one other, sorry, just let me add to that one point there. One other thing you can do for the parasitoids is consider them when you are thinking about spraying for other pests, say like aphids or something in your cereal crop. If those aphids aren't at the economic threshold level, it should not need to be sprayed, because when you spray out the aphids, you're killing beneficial insects as well. That is controlling the sawfly that you weren't even thinking about when you're thinking about your aphids. So we want to reduce unnecessary pesticide use.
Yeah, that reminds me another interesting thing is when you're spraying for cabbage seed-pod weevil in canola, right? You may be getting the parasitoids that are emerging from the wheat from the previous year. And you're actually killing the parasitoids that might help you control your sawfly in the adjacent crops. So that's another thing to keep in mind. And that's why it's really important to think about the overall farming system. Like, think about what crops you have in your area beside your canola, that you might be losing the beneficial insects that might be helping you to control those parasitoids, control those pests.
Yeah, and it becomes this, it becomes a, if it gets bad, it becomes sort of a, a compounding problem, because going back to what Hector said, like, there's a lot of things you can do with harvest management tactics, even if you don't have a stripper header. if you could straight cut and not swath, you would conserve the beneficial insect. So, it's really thinking about, you want to farm the beneficial, you don't want to farm the sawfly. So
I like that.
part of that in the fall is that even if if you did enough right through the growing season and the preparations ahead of it, maybe that affords you the opportunity to straight cut. Well, now you're straight cutting, so now you're conserving, and you're particularly conserving because as soon as your height gets above, I'm trying to do the conversion here, as soon as it gets well above 6 inches, so if you're cutting ideally a foot, if you're cutting that high, there's a really high probability that you're cutting above where the beneficial insect is residing. And we've done a study on that. And of course, stripper header is going to completely, reduce the risk of combining beneficials. So, but you can't do any of that if your field's gone down to cutting, because now you have to pull out the swather. And not only are you swathing, you normally aren't able to swath it above 6 inches, and particularly when it's gone down, you're down almost at the ground trying to recover as much as you can. So you're grinding up the beneficials as much as you are the sawflies. In fact, the sawflies are probably surviving better because they've gone down and prepared for overwintering. So they're almost at or below the soil surface, whereas the beneficials might be slightly above.
How does that translate, Brian? Sorry, just to interrupt for 1 second there. The guys that are cutting either, straight cutting likely, and then going in and haying the rest and cutting it right down. How does that affect things?
Well, I mean, if they're going in and removing straw, they're probably exporting the beneficials. So again, it goes back to, what do you want to farm? Do you want to farm the sawfly, or do you want to farm the beneficial? And harvest management for farming the beneficial is probably the critical point, aside from being super careful about spraying. So you're trying to protect that early season beneficial cycle by doing strategic spraying. So that's why I'm a bit hesitant to talk about the growing degree day calculation when sawflies are probably going to be out, but then in the fall, and I still believe this. I think you can have that first cycle out there all you want, but if you don't have the second cycle, that parasitoid population, it's not going to impact the sawflies much at all. You have to be able to farm that beneficial second cycle and get it to emerge to do the work for you that you need.
Hector, did you have something else to add?
A couple of things. One of them is that people have actually tried to relocate parasitoid, and I think it might work. I know Dave Weaver in Montana, they've done this where they actually collect the straw in the spring, and then if you know of a site where you have lots of parasitoids, you can actually collect the straw and move it to another field where you want to establish the parasitoids. That's something that we haven't tried in Alberta, but it seems to work in Montana, so there's really no reason why it shouldn't work here. The last thing I want to say is that spraying insecticides has been shown over and over and over again that it does not work for the sawfly. The sawfly doesn't have a single peak in flight. You will continue to see adults kind of coming in waves. So you spray today, and there's probably already eggs in the stems, and there will be more eggs laid next day from new adults. So spraying has been tried many times, and it's a waste of time, and you're kind of shooting yourself in the foot by killing the parasitoids rather than killing the sawfly.
Yeah, and can I add one more thing? Interesting thing about our beneficial insect is there was a study in Montana that came out a few years ago that found that these parasitoids, if they have flowering plants to eat, but nectar is what they eat when they're in their adult stage, right? So in the study, they had parasitoids that they didn't feed and versus the ones that they did feed. So the ones that they fed lived 3 times longer, the parasitoids, right? They produced 4 times more eggs, and the eggs they did produce were bigger. So what that translates to in the field is a few flowering plants even a few flowering weeds in your field can boost the beneficial population and effectiveness in controlling your sawfly. So a few weeds might be okay.
Or some of those wild areas, like, and they were talking
Yeah.
about their agronomy update yesterday.
Yeah, like field edges. I don't know how far these little wasps fly though, but that's why I'm thinking weeds that are actually in the field are not always the end of the world. It could be supplementing your beneficial insect population.
One summer we actually found tons and tons of parasitoids in the ditch, and I think it was one of those years where the crop took a long time to mature, so there was a really good crop of the second cycle of parasitoids, and they will fly towards the ditches where there's still green grasses and potentially there's late maturing sawfly. So one thing to keep in mind is, I guess, if you have grasshoppers, you may want to avoid spraying the ditches for grasshoppers if you might have parasitoids there also. So another thing to keep in mind.
Great. So if we get, you know, a standard spring, are we going to see any changes or in our wheat stem sawfly population, or is there any weather conditions that might have a detrimental impact?
Would you like me to tackle that one first?
Yes, please.
The sawfly adults, the females, they seem to be a little bit wimpy. They don't do very well when there are adverse conditions. They really like very hot conditions. So if you have a lot of rain or wind, they kind of don't fly as much. So if you see those conditions, you probably will reduce the risk. But eventually they will start to fly and look for the host. They're not very strong flyers, so nobody really knows exactly how far away they will fly, but they can fly probably 1 or 2 kilometers. But I don't think the climate is a huge factor as far as, say, the winter killing sawfly. We've done some studies and we know that the overwintering mortality is very low. It's something like less than 10% of the sawfly actually die. They're very, very cold hardy. And like Brian said earlier on, they're almost below the ground. So they're very well protected there. So people have tried to burn the fields to try to get rid of sawfly. It doesn't work. You're just killing the organic matter, destroying the organic matter. But the sawfly tend to survive. You're also killing the parasitoid by doing that. So those things don't work. Yeah, the weather is important in terms of having a season that allows the crop to mature late. Then you have the second generation of the parasitoid surviving and then actually increasing population to the level where the following year you should see high numbers of parasitoids.
Great. Haley or Brian, did you have anything to add?
Yeah, I could add something. Hector and I were involved in a climate modeling study that was published last year. And because we know that in-season weather affects sawfly populations, the model predicted, as our summers get drier, that sawfly will be moving farther north into the Peace region, where it currently isn't there. So we're expecting that the entire wheat growing region in Alberta and Saskatchewan will be better habitat for sawfly than it is now due to the drier conditions that we're expecting. So that means that producers that are in areas where sawfly hasn't historically been a problem need to keep looking out for them.
Great.
Yeah.
Entomologists, there's some bad news.
Yeah, we got a couple of Debbie Downers below me.
We just want everyone to scout, that's all.
Yeah, that's fair. Did you guys have anything additional that you feel we didn't cover about wheat stem sawfly?
Yeah, I just want to circle back to nitrogen for a second. And this relates to dry, fairly dry land type wheat production. And we know you really don't need a whole lot more than, 60 to 90 kilograms of nitrogen per hectare actual. But we tend to sometimes over fertilize if we're predicting little bit wetter conditions. And I think we've gotten used to applying a bit more just because we've had those wetter, higher yielding conditions. But that could lead to less than desirable expression of the solid stem. So I would again just temper things back, and maybe this is a good conversation to have in the context also of thinking about split applications of N. So I certainly wouldn't recommend a total of more than 90 kilograms of nitrogen per hectare, because beyond that you're really going to be creating that lush canopy. Yeah, you might optimize your yield a little bit more, but probably you already have at 60 to 90. But you'll be impacting your protein for sure, but that could come at a cost of a lot more cutting, and protein premiums aren't going to pay for 15% losses in your grain yield because of cutting.
I don't know if we have time, but I just thought about something kind of interesting about the biology of the software that people might find interesting also. Maybe only entomology nerds find this interesting though. Is that the fact that the female sawflies can actually differentiate between the quality of the host of the wheat. So the females, when they go up and down the stem, right, and they're trying to assess whether a wheat stem is good enough for the progeny, for the eggs they're going to lay, they can actually somehow tell if the stem is thick enough. They actually will stick a female egg in the stem. And if the stem is thin, say, oh, this is not a very good stem, so I'm going to stick a useless male in the stem. This actually can have some management implications, because like Brian was saying earlier, farmers can manipulate seeding density and plant density. So if you're planting a solid stem cultivar, you should, like Brian suggested, you should reduce the seeding rate because you want to maximize the expression of the solid stem, right, of the solidity of the stem. But also it could be interesting, and we tried to show this in an experiment, but it didn't work out too well. But I think in theory, if you have fewer stems, they're going to be thicker, and the solid stem, you actually will trick the female into laying female eggs, and then that should cut down the population of sawfly over the long term. If you're planting a hollow wheat, then you want to increase the seeding rate, right? Because you're going to have more thin stems. And then these more thin stems may actually fool the sawfly into putting more males, because, oh, these are thin stems, bad quality, I'm going to stick a male egg in them. So that's kind of an interesting bit of biology, which with management implications.
That is great. I think just to kind of wrap things up, for growers that are in the high risk areas, so places like 40 Mile that have been flagged as potential high risk for this area, make sure you're out and scouting. And for those counties that have reduced numbers like Vulcan, and you're not out of the clear. Basically, we want you to still be out checking your fields and making sure, because of the, the way we do the sampling isn't necessarily indicative of the whole county. So you still could be at risk. Is there any final comments from any of you? Perfect. I want to thank you all for joining me and sharing all your expertise and knowledge with all of us, and truly appreciate your time.
Thank you very much, Jamie.
Thanks for inviting us.
Yeah, you bet. Have a great night. You guys don't have to like Zoom tomorrow, do you? You get a break?
Some Zooming.
We gotta Zoom every day.
Oh, nuts, eh? Inevitable.
Yeah.
All right. Have a great night.
Yeah.
Okay, good night.
Thanks.
Bye.
Bye.